Hi, my sweet friends. So look at what I have here today. Winn Dixie, because of Winn Dixie, I should say. And I am in reading mode ready. Of course, I have my mints and I have a bottle of water in case I get thirsty. But I thought it would be nice if we read Winn Dixie together. I know that we left off in the middle of the book, but I thought it would be nice if I read the first 5 chapters in this video, and then I read the next 5 chapters in another video. And if you would like to reread with me, that would be great because I'm starting on chapter 1. And for those of you who are doing any character work, this will be a good reminder. Talking deeply about the characters, not just their outer features, but on the inside, who are they as people? And what do we know about them so far? So, Because of Winn Dixie, by one of my favorite authors, Kate DiCamillo. So as you know, hold on, because I get a little bit cuckoo crazy when I read and I use my accents and my different voices, right? All right, so Because of Winn Dixie. My name is India Opal Baloney. And last summer, my daddy, the preacher, sent me to the store for a box of macaroni and cheese, some white rice, and 2 tomatoes. And I came back with a dog. This is what happened. I walked into the produce section of the Winn Dixie grocery store to pick out 2 tomatoes, and I almost bumped right into the store manager. He was standing there all red-faced, screaming and waving his arms around. "Who let a dog in here?" he kept on shouting. "Who let a dirty dog in here?" At first, I didn't see a dog. There was just a lot of vegetables rolling around on the floor, tomatoes and onions and green peppers. And there was what seemed like a whole army of Winn Dixie employees running around waving their arms just the same way the store manager was waving his. And then the dog came running around the corner. He was a big dog and ugly, and he looked like he was having a real good time. His tongue was hanging out, and he was wagging his tail, and he skidded to a stop, and he smiled right at me. I had never before in my life seen a dog smile, but that's what he did, all right. He pulled back his lips, and he showed me all his teeth. Then he wagged his tail so hard that he knocked over some oranges on his display, and then they went rolling everywhere, mixing in with the tomatoes and the onions and the green peppers. The manager screamed, "Somebody grab that dog!" The dog went running over to the manager, wagging his tail and smiling. He stood up on his hind legs. He could tell that all he wanted to do was get face to face with the manager, thank him for the good time he was having in the produce department. But somehow he ended up knocking the manager over, and the manager must have had a bad day because he was lying there on the floor right in front of everybody, and he started to cry. The dog leaned over, real concerned, and licked his face. "Please," said the manager, "somebody call the pound." "Wait a minute," I hollered. "That's my dog. Don't call the pound." All the Winn Dixie employees turned around and looked at me, and I knew I had done something big, maybe stupid too, but I couldn't help it. I couldn't let that dog go to the pound. Speaking of dog, I have one crying at my door. Chloe, you can come in as long as you don't bark. You want to see everyone, Chloe Belle? You want to see everyone? Come here. Come here. Come here. Come here, Chloe. Come up. Come up. You gonna come up? Come see Mama. Come up. Good girl. Come here. No, you don't want to come up. Chloe Belle. Let me see if I can show you Chloe Belle. And then we'll get back to Winn Dixie. It's okay. Oh, you're being shy. Where are you, Chloe? Chloe Belle, come here. It's okay. Hi. Hello, baby goo. There's a Chloe Belle. Oh, Okay, now back to the story. So as I was saying, boys and girls, I'm sorry for the interruption. Okay, so I couldn't help it. I couldn't let that dog go to the pound. I'm on page 10, by the way. Here, boy, I said. The dog stopped licking the manager's face and put his ears up in the air, and he looked at me like he was trying to remember if he knew me from somewhere. Here, boy, I said again. And then I figured that the dog was probably just like everybody else in the world and that he wanted to get called by a name. Only I didn't know what his name was. So I just said the first thing that came to my head. I said, "Here, Winn, Dixie." And that dog, he came trotting over to me just like he had been doing it his whole life. The manager sat up and gave me a hard stare like maybe I was making fun of him. "It's his name," I said. "Honest." The manager said, "Don't you know you're not supposed to bring a dog in the store?" "Yes, sir," I said. "He got in by mistake. I'm sorry, it won't happen again." "Come on, Winn, Dixie," I said to the dog. I started walking and he followed right along. Like as I went out of the produce department and down to the cereal aisle and past all the cashiers and right out the door. Once we were safe outside, I checked him over real careful, and he didn't look that good. He was big, but he was skinny, and you could see all of his ribs. And there were bald patches all over him, places where he didn't have any fur at all. Mostly he looked like a big piece of old brown carpet that had been left out in the rain. "You're a mess," I told him. "I bet you don't belong to anybody." He smiled at me. He did that thing again where he pulled back his lips and he showed me his teeth. And he smiled so big that it made him sneeze. It was like he was saying, "I know I'm a mess, isn't it funny?" It's hard not to immediately fall in love with a dog who has a good sense of humor. "Come on," I told him. "Let's see what the preacher has to say about you." And the two of us, me and Winn Dixie, started walking home. Okay, my friends, chapter 2. I might take off my glasses, and I know you guys aren't used to seeing me without my glasses on, but the glasses give such a glare on the video, and I'm reading up close anyway, so let's see how that works for a little bit, and then I'll probably put them back on. Okay, so chapter 2. That summer, I found Winn Dixie was also the summer me and the preacher moved to Naomi, Florida, so that he could be the new preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church in Naomi. My daddy's a good preacher and a nice man, but sometimes it's hard for me to think about him as my daddy because he spends so much time preaching or thinking about preaching or getting ready to preach. And so in my mind, I think of him as the preacher. Before I was born, he was a missionary in India, and that's how I got my first name. But he calls me by my second name, Opal, because that's his mama's name, and he loved her a lot. Anyway, while me and Winn Dixie walked home, I told him how I got my name, and I told him how I had just moved to Naomi. I also told him about the preacher and how he was a good man, even if he was too distracted with sermons and prayers and suffering people to go grocery shopping. But you know what? I told Winn Dixie, "You're a suffering dog, so maybe he'll take you in right away. Maybe he'll let me keep you." Winn Dixie looked up at me and he wagged his tail. He was kind of limping like something was wrong with one of his legs. I have to admit, he stunk bad. He was an ugly dog, but already I loved him with all my heart. When we got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told Winn Dixie that he had to behave right and be quiet because this was an all-adult trailer park, and the only reason I got to live in it was because the preacher was a preacher and I was a good, quiet kid. I was what the Friendly Corners trailer park manager, Mr. Alfred, called an exception. And I told Winn Dixie he had to act like an exception too. Specifically, I told him not to pick any fights with Mr. Alfred's cats or Mrs. Detweller's little yappy Yorkie dog, Samuel. When Dixie looked up at me while I was telling him everything, and I swear he understood. Sit, I told him when we got to my trailer. He sat right down. He had good manners. Stay here, I told him. I'll be right back. The preacher was sitting in the living room, working at the little fold-out table. He had papers spread all around him, and he was rubbing his nose, which always means he's thinking of something real hard. Daddy? I said. He said, Daddy, do you know how you always tell me that we need to help those that are less fortunate than ourselves? He said. He rubbed his nose and he looked around at his papers. Well, I said, I found a less fortunate at the grocery store. Is that right? He asked. Yes, sir, I said. I stared at the preacher real hard. Sometimes he reminded me of a turtle hiding inside its shell, in there thinking about things and not ever sticking his head out into the world. Daddy, I was wondering, could this little less fortunate, could he stay with us for a while? Finally, the preacher looked up at me. Opal, he said, what are you talking about? I found a dog, I told him, and I want to keep him. Oh, no dogs, the preacher said. We've talked about this before. You don't need a dog. I know it, I said. I know I don't need a dog, but this dog, he needs me. Look, I said. I went to the trailer door and I hollered, Winn, Dixie. You want to see my dog right now? We're getting rid of an old mattress and it's on the floor, and it gives Chloe Belle the perfect height to look out the window as I read. Okay, good girl, Chloe Belle. So India Opal says, Winn, Dixie. When Dixie's ear shot up in the air and he grinned and sneezed, and then he came limping up the steps and into the trailer, and he put his head right in the preacher's lap, right on top of the pile of papers. The preacher looked at Winn Dixie. He looked at me. And then he looked at his ribs and his matted up fur and the places where he was bald. The preacher's nose wrinkled up. Like I said, the dog smelled pretty bad. When Dixie looked up at the preacher, he pulled back his lips and he showed the preacher all of his crooked yellow teeth, and he wagged his tail and he knocked over some of the preacher's papers off the table. And then he sneezed and some of the other papers fluttered to the floor. What did you call this dog? The preacher asked. Winn Dixie, I whispered. I was afraid to say anything too loud. I could see that Winn Dixie was having a good effect on the preacher. He was making him poke his head out of his shell. Well, said the preacher, he's a stray if I've ever did seen one. He put down his pencil and he scratched Winn Dixie behind the ears. And less fortunate, too. That's for sure. Are you looking for a home? Are you looking for one? The preacher asked real soft to Winn Dixie. Winn Dixie wagged his tail. Well, said the preacher, I guess you found one. So we are 13 minutes in. I'm going to read one more chapter, magic number 3. I'll post it to our classroom, and then I'll read 3 more. Okay, I hope you're enjoying the story with me. Do you remember all of these book talks that we had on these chapters, my friends? We know that India Opal was at the grocery store by herself because the preacher, he doesn't do a whole lot other than preach, right? That's his life, and he's really consumed by it. She described him as if he were a turtle in his own shell, and he only pokes out every so often. So we talked about how even though she's like around your age, she was at the grocery store buying things for dinner, and how that's very unexpected. And we also talked about how Winn Dixie really caused a ruckus. It was a debacle in that store, and she was trying to rescue him, right? And they live in a trailer park. They just moved from another part of Florida to Naomi. So let's keep reading. We're going to read chapter 3, and then I will upload this to our classroom. So chapter 3, page 20. I started in on Winn Dixie right away trying to clean him up. First, I gave him a bath. I used my garden hose and some baby shampoo, and he stood still for it, but I could tell he didn't like it. He looked insulted, and the whole time he didn't show me his teeth or wag his tail once. When he was all washed and dried, I brushed him real good. I used my own hairbrush, and I worked real hard at all of the knots and the patches and the fur that was stuck together. He didn't mind being brushed. He wiggled his back like it felt pretty good. The whole time I was working on him, I was talking to him, and he listened. I told him how we were alike. See, I said, you don't have any family, and neither do I. I've got the preacher, of course, but I don't have a mama. I mean, I have one, but I don't know where she is. She left when I was 3 years old. I can hardly remember her. And I bet you don't remember your mama much either. So we're almost like orphans. Winn-Dixie looked straight at me when I said that to him, like he was feeling relieved to finally have somebody that understood his situation. I nodded my head at him and I went on talking. I don't even have any friends because I had to leave them all behind when we moved here from Watley. Watley's up in North Florida. Have you ever been to North Florida? Winn-Dixie looked down at the ground like he was trying to remember if he had. You know what, I said, ever since we moved here, I've been thinking about my mama extra hard, more than I ever did when I was in Watley. Winn-Dixie twitched his ears and raised his eyebrows. I think the preacher thinks about my mama all the time, too. He's still in love with her. I know that because I heard the ladies at the church in Watley talking about him. They said he's still hoping that she'll come back, but he doesn't tell me that. He won't talk to me about her at all. I want to know more about her, but I'm afraid to ask the preacher. I'm afraid he'll get mad at me. Winn-Dixie looked at me hard like he was trying to say something. What? I said. He stared at me. You think I should make the preacher tell me about her? Winn-Dixie looked at me so hard he sneezed. Oh, I'll think about it, I said. When I was done working on him, Winn-Dixie looked a whole lot better. He still had his bald spots, but the fur that he did have cleaned up nice. It was all shiny and soft. You could still see his ribs, but I intended to feed him good. That would be taken care of. I couldn't do anything about his crooked yellow teeth because he got into a sneezing fit every time I started brushing them with my toothbrush. And I finally had to give up. But for the most part, he looked a whole lot better, and so I took him into the trailer and I showed him to the preacher. Daddy? He said. He was working on a sermon and he was kind of muttering to himself. Daddy, I wanted to show you the new Winn-Dixie. The preacher put down his pencil and he rubbed his nose and he finally looked up. Well, he said, smiling real big at Winn-Dixie. Well, now, don't you look handsome? Winn-Dixie smiled back at the preacher. He went over and he put his head in the preacher's lap. He smells nice, too, said the preacher. He rubbed Winn-Dixie's head and he looked into my eyes. Daddy, I said real quick before I lost my nerve. Oh, I've been talking to Winn-Dixie. Oh, is that right? Asked the preacher. Well, yes, I've been talking to him. And, he agreed with me that since I'm 10 years old, you should tell me 10 things about my mama. Just 10 things, that's all. The preacher stopped rubbing Winn-Dixie's head, held real still. I could see he was thinking about pulling his head back into his shell. One thing for each year I've been alive, I told him, please. Winn-Dixie looked up at the preacher and kind of gave him a nudge with his nose. The preacher sighed, and he said to Winn-Dixie, I should have guessed you were going to be trouble. And then he looked at me and he said, come on, Opal, sit down. I'll tell you 10 things about your mama.